The Mormon problem? Right or wrong, something must be done.
But if a true love of the Constitution and the wholesome laws of the Union are to be the criterion, then most assuredly does Utah shine peerless among her sisters. It is both a right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery.
What is the cause of the hostile feelings against this people? All hell has moved against them because the kingdoms of darkness are in danger. All hell has moved against this people because we are of one heart and of one mind.
We're gonna scalp Brigham!
In the summer of 1857, Abraham O. Smoot, carrying the mail from Salt Lake City to Independence, Missouri, heard incredible news. The United States Army was coming west to quell a supposed rebellion in Utah Territory. In 1847, the first Mormon pioneers had entered the Salt Lake Valley, leaving behind mobs and persecution, but bringing with them the American flag. Barely had the dust settled from their wagons than they were applying for admission into the Union as the state of Deseret. Those in the federal government rejected the proposal to create a state covering such a large area. Instead, they reduced the boundaries of the proposed state, changed the name, and in 1850 created the Territory of Utah, appointing Brigham Young as governor. Under his direction, there were soon settlements throughout the territory. It seemed the Saints had reached a safe haven at last. Then, in 1857, Judge William W. Drummond fanned the fires of political persecution which had been burning for some years. He had served in Utah during the previous 2 years as a federal district judge, but had antagonized the Mormon community by his corrupt administration and personal morals. He finally left Utah in the face of social ostracism. His animosity toward the Saints was evident in his letter of resignation. In that document, he alleged that the Mormon Church was not obedient to the laws enacted by the United States Congress. That there was no law but a secret organization called the priesthood, set apart in the territory to take lives and property. And that Supreme Court records had been destroyed by order of Brigham Young. These and other charges made by critics of the church in the territory arrived in Washington at a time when the Mormons, along with slavery, had become a political issue. John C. Fremont was the presidential candidate of the newly organized Republican Party, whose platform took the position that it is both the right and the imperative duty of Congress to prohibit those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy, and slavery. The Democrats, on the other hand, had stressed squatter sovereignty, which would allow each state to determine whether to allow slavery within its borders. It was felt that such self-rule would also allow them to determine which forms of marriage to permit. It appears that President Buchanan, in order to prove that the Democrats were as thoroughly anti-polygamy as the Republicans, considered it necessary to approve an army expedition to Utah to accompany a new governor, Alfred E. Cumming, to replace Brigham Young, and to put down the supposed treasonous rebellion. In May of 1857, United States troops gathered from throughout the United States to Fort Leavenworth, preparatory to the Western March. It was at this time that Abraham O. Smoot verified the news of the troop movements and their purpose. He returned west immediately, averaging 50 miles a day in his carriage. In company with Judson Stoddard and Orrin Porter Rockwell, he reached Salt Lake City only to find it deserted. Most of the Saints had gone to Silver Lake in Big Cottonwood Canyon, now known as Brighton, to celebrate the 10th anniversary of their entering the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young waited until evening to make a public announcement of the Army's approach. He later commented,
10 years ago, a few of the elders arrived here and began to plow and to plant seeds. While speaking to the brethren on that day, I said, if the people of the United States will let us alone for 10 years, we will ask no odds from them. And 10 years from that very day, we had a message that the government had stopped the mail and ordered 2,500 troops to come here. We will resist aggression by making appeal to God and our own right arms.
The Saints, bullied and burned out of Missouri and Illinois, although not wanting to fight, were determined not to be caught unprepared. Missionaries in England, Canada, and Hawaii were called home. And those in outlying settlements were called into the Salt Lake Valley to help fortify against the enemy. Daniel H. Wells was assigned as the commanding general of the Utah militia, and soon, on Temple Square, the Saints were manufacturing firearms instead of building their temple. Meanwhile, the United States Army approached. Captain Stuart Van Vliet traveled to Salt Lake City ahead of the troops to make arrangements to house the Army and find forage for their animals when they arrived. Captain Van Vliet was invited to attend services in the old tabernacle on Temple Square. There he was shown the unity of the saints. Apostle John Taylor asked the congregation,
"Would you, if necessary, brethren, put the torch to your buildings and lay them in ashes and wander homeless in the mountains? All you that are willing to set fire to your property rather than submit to military rule and oppression, manifest it by raising your hands."
The congregation unanimously raised their hands. Captain Van Vliet quickly returned to South Pass to meet the Army. He told them they had better not enter the valley. The Mormons were prepared. The Saints fortified Echo Canyon, 40 miles northeast of Salt Lake City, with 1,100 men. Still others were sent out as scouts. This group cached their supplies near Devil's Gate and kept a constant stream of riders traveling back and forth to Salt Lake to keep Brigham Young informed of the Army's position. And under the direction of Lot Smith, bands of men were instructed to burn the government wagons, run their cattle off, and keep them from sleep by staging surprise night raids, but never to take human life. Lot Smith described his activities.
On nearing the wagons, I inquired after the captain of the train. Mr. Dawson stepped out and said that he was the man. I told him that I had a little business with him. He inquired the nature of it, and I replied by requesting him to get all of his property as quickly as possible out of the wagons, for I meant to put a little fire into them. I told him that I'd give him a wagon load of provisions. He begged me not to burn the train while he was in sight and said it would ruin his reputation as a wagon master. I told him not to be squeamish, that the trains burned very nicely. I had seen them before and that we didn't have time to be ceremonious.
The harassment by Lot Smith and his band continued. 72 wagons burned with about 300,000 pounds of food. They even captured 1,400 head of cattle and brought them back to the valley. And as winter closed rapidly down on the Army, now under the command of Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston, Lot Smith's band burned the prairies before them, leaving very little grazing lands for their animals. With the temperatures ranging from 15 above to 44 below zero, the Army pressed on. It was no longer a matter of glory for the soldiers, but whether they made it to their refuge, Fort Bridger, for winter quarters. It took them 15 days to travel the last 35 miles to the fort, only to find it had recently been burned to the ground by the Mormons, who had purchased it 2 years earlier. Only a single stone wall was left to offer protection from the mountain winter. Here, the Army set up what they called Camp Scott, while some 300 yards away, Governor and Mrs. Cumming, with other government officials, dwelt in a small settlement of tents and dugouts. With the Army stopped in Wyoming for the winter, the Saints felt their prayers had been answered. The Army had not come to Utah.
Come, brethren, listen to my song, doo-dah, doo-dah. I don't intend to keep you long, oh, doo-dah day. About Uncle Sam, I'm gonna sing, doo-dah, doo-dah. He swears destruction on us to bring, oh, doo-dah day. Let there be your hand, by Brigham Young to stand, and if our enemies do appear, we'll sweep them from the land. Johnston's army's on the way, doo-dah.
In February of 1858, Colonel Thomas Kane arrived in Salt Lake City as an unofficial emissary from President Buchanan. Colonel Kane, a longtime friend of the Mormons, had offered his services as a mediator. He was warmly received by Brigham Young and other leading authorities, and they discussed peace terms. Then Colonel Kane traveled to the Army settlement and convinced Governor Cumming to accept President Young's invitation to enter the city without an Army escort. It was April when he and Governor Cumming set out for Salt Lake City. As they came down Echo Canyon, many night bonfires along the ridge gave the false impression that the Mormons were present in great strength. In Salt Lake City, Governor Cumming was received with all due respect. He examined the public records and reported to Washington that all was in order, contrary to Judge Drummond's accusations. At the same time, under directions from Brigham Young, 30,000 saints in the valley were leaving their homes, moving 600 wagons a day towards Utah County, some 30 miles south of Salt Lake City. President Young had instructed the saints that they were to trust in God, to go into the desert and not fight. Back east, editorial pressure had been devastating for the Buchanan presidency. The so-called Utah Expedition had become Buchanan's blunder. Under an avalanche of public criticism, President Buchanan sent a peace commission to Utah. In June 1858, the commission met in the council house with the leading brethren. There they discussed the terms of peace. It was agreed to allow the army to travel peacefully through the valley, and that they could establish a camp, but not nearer than 40 miles from Salt Lake City. On June 13th, the army left their winter quarters and 13 days later entered Salt Lake City, only to find that it was completely deserted. The saints had all fled south, leaving only a few guards who brandished torches ready to fire the hay-filled homes should the army deviate from the path through the city which they had agreed upon. One soldier, Charles Scott, reported,
It was like entering a graveyard. Silence reigned supreme. If a plague had threatened it instead of us, it could have not been depopulated more.
Colonel St. George Cook, one of the military leaders, respectfully removed his hat in honor of those who had once accompanied him in the Mormon battalion. On their way towards the south end of the valley, the company of soldiers camped at Jordan Narrows. While there, they were passed by saints returning to their homes. The army eventually established Camp Floyd at the community of Fairfield, over 40 miles southwest of Salt Lake City. President Buchanan offered full pardon to the Mormons if they would accept the authority of the United States, and President Young accepted the pardon, saying,
The Mormons are a loyal and law-abiding people and have ever been. It is true that Lot Smith burned some wagons containing government supplies for the army. If it is for this that we are to be pardoned, I accept the pardon.
The war was over, but the army stayed on at Camp Floyd. This encampment proved both an economic boon and a social detriment to Utah. On one hand, the saints found a nearby market for their produce and labor. Nearby farmers received top dollar for the crops they sold to the military and even hired on to build the camp. Then, in 3 years, when the army left to fight in the Civil War, the saints bought $4 million worth of surplus goods, equipment, and supplies for only $100,000. But on the other hand, even though the army had left, vice increased in the territory. In the wake of army camp followers who stayed behind, crime grew dramatically and had a devastating effect. The culture and heritage of the Mormon heartland would never again be the same. In all, manpower of over 5,000 men and $40 million had been spent on a venture that had resulted in shame for the United States and suffering for her army. During the entire episode, rumors had run wild. The only thing anybody was sure of was that everyone was confused. Reporter Jesse Coe summarized it by writing, "Wounded? None. Killed? None. Fooled? Everybody." And through this experience, the Mormons in Utah exemplified their faith and trust in God. Even in the face of annihilation by an enemy army, they knew that God's will would prevail.